Hi guys, and welcome to episode 10 of Behind the Frame. Today I'm going to be looking at the post-processing on a line image. This image was shot in the Mara, and for those of you who follow us on Instagram or any other social media channels, you would probably be quite familiar with this line. This is the well-known scar. It was taken last year, towards the end of last year, and it's quite a memorable day for me because the guest that I was in the vehicle with, we literally spent the entire day sitting with him. For most of the time, he was a flat cat underneath a boskia and really didn't do much, but we dedicated ourselves to the cause and we literally spent the entire day with him. This was the start of him getting up to move. You can see in the image here that he is very alert. He was actually watching a female, which was couple of 100 meters away, and so he was just keeping his eye or eyes, looking at that scar, on her the whole time, and that made for some great photography. This was a quite close proximity, and that's why you've got such a shallow depth of field. If you have a look at the settings here, it was shot at 1/1250th of a second at f4.5, ISO 320, underexposing by one full stop. It was overcast. We did quite a bit of blacks in here, and I really didn't want to lose any detail on the muzzle here in these white areas. In hindsight, f4.5, you can see the angle of the face. This eye is slightly closer than that one. Very shallow depth of field. You can see it drops off on the main. Typically with these portraits, the closer you are, you want to be shooting with a little bit of extra depth of field. I chose to shoot this at a very shallow depth of field to try and get this effect which drew you into his eye and really use that as the central feature, which on this particular line is really one of the key features. And then obviously it was taken on a Canon 1DX Mark II. And from a cropping perspective, if we start to have a look here, you will see that what we've done is actually covered in last week's video on cropping. So I've taken that same crop where I've then moved along this side of the frame here. I've removed a piece of grass through that. I've brought this little corner in right onto the edge, and I've removed a lot of this distracting grass over here. So if you really want to see how I've cropped this, don't forget to check out last week's episode. That's episode 9 of Behind the Frame. Right, so this is the finished image, and what I really wanted to go into on here is I'm going to focus on the use of the special adjustment brush. Now, I must say before we start that this, from a before and after, is quite extreme for me. I'm very conservative in my adjustments, and probably this is one of the images where I've pushed things a little bit more in terms of the use of the special adjustment brush. But hopefully when you look at this image, the overall effect is not one of, oh, that's completely fake. And as you can see, it doesn't really differ that much from the original image. And this is what post-processing should be aligned for, in terms of heightening and exaggerating your story, making it more obvious and more evident and more appealing to the viewer. So I'm going to have a look quickly just through some of the basic adjustments here. I lifted the exposure a little bit, added a little bit of global contrast at this point, pulled the highlights down. So if you have a look here, just in those areas around the muzzle, you can see with that exposure adjustment there that we started to lose detail there. So I've brought that back so we don't lose any of the detail in that section. Lifted the whites slightly, blacks just to get those nice and dark around the main here. So if we take those back to 0, you can see it looks a little bit washed out and more grayscale. I'm going for a dark and moody effect, so somewhere around here is good. Just a hint of clarity at +3. Having a look at the tone curve, lifting the whites. So you remember what we said about contrast is that you're taking your brightest whites and your darkest whites and we're stretching them out a little bit. And you can see here that that makes quite a big difference to the overall contrast in the image. And then the same with the darks. We're pulling those down a touch and you can see that it just it makes those blacks a little bit more rich. And with these big black maned lines, that's really what you want to try and do. Obviously, you don't want to lose too much detail, especially in the hair areas over here. If anything, I've maybe lost some detail down in this dark corner here. Now, for me, that does not concern me at all. I'm not interested in seeing the detail here. And in fact, having this darker corner here gives me a little bit of contrast. Remember, our eye is drawn to the brightest, sharpest part of the image. And so this white muzzle, very sharp detail in the face here. So we're drawn here. And if this was any lighter, we'd probably be gravitating that way. So the darker corner helps to keep our attention into the center of the frame over here. On the black and white side of things, you'll remember one of the first images I did was on black and white. You can see how I've used the color channels here. If I switch off the color channels now, so what you're going to see here is Lightroom's automatic mix, black and white mix, and that's what it gives us. And you can see it's a very kind of generic, washed out, kind of grayscale type of thing. But once I've gone in and made some adjustments in terms of darkening the orange areas, so if you have a look at this adjustment on the main, pulling those down just a touch. The same with the greens, which obviously occur in the background there. If we lift those up, and so what we start to then get is that kind of not quite a high key, but you get the brighter background. So the contrast along this area of the main and the background is increased. And then on the yellow sliders, obviously this is going to affect mainly the overall image and the line himself, and we just lift those a touch. From a detail and sharpening side of things, if we have a look here, I've gone for quite an aggressive sharpen, and the masking is less than I normally would go. So often on bigger images we'll go to something along these lines. Now I want to try and sharpen as much of that detail in the face as possible. I've increased the radius, and this is because I have more pixels making up these edges. If you think back to the original crop, this image is quite pixel rich, and so when it comes to the sharpening at 100%, if we go and have a look at some of these areas here, before and after, you can see it is quite punchy, but that goes with the overall effect that we're looking for here. Black and white, you tend to push things a little bit more. You've got a bit more creative license. So along with the contrast and what I'm going to show you with the localized adjustment brush, a little bit more extra sharpening in here just to really give it that punch that we're looking for. And so now if we go through and have a look at the real star of the show here, I'm going to have a look. Remember that these effects are already being applied. And you can see I've used 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 different brushes on this. So as I said, it's quite extreme. But hopefully you're looking at this now and saying, oh wow. Because the idea is that even though the overall image looks great, it hasn't got to a point where you're looking at it saying, oh, I can see all the brush strokes and it's maybe a bit over the top. So we're going to have a look at what each of these little brush adjustments has done and why it was done. So obviously in this bottom corner over here, let me show you what the overall on and off with before and after just the brush strokes being removed now. This is without any brush strokes applied. Watch again, brush strokes back and before. Now what you can see is that obviously the outer edges become a bit darker and the face becomes a little bit brighter. And so from an overall viewing perspective, when you first look at this image, you're more locked into the center of the frame, which is where the lion's face is. And that's what I want to try and tell from a story perspective. So you can see it's small but big adjustments, if that makes any sense. And hopefully as I walk through and show you guys now, it'll start to make a bit more sense. So let's start with this brush down in the bottom corner over here. You can see that's a very small area. And that really is just to take away the last little corner in there. There was a little patch of lighter area which I wanted to darken. So the adjustment that I've applied there is to pull down the blacks and the exposure a little bit, just to darken off that little last corner of the frame. Then if we have a look working from the outside in, now here you can see that I've gone through and I've made a number of brush strokes around. And again, looking at the adjustments, if you come all the way over to the right hand side of the panel over here, the exposure adjustment and the blacks adjustment has been dropped down. So have a look at the areas that I've brushed in on this. So on the left hand side of the frame, this whole section over here, obviously just to darken that, because it's an edge, if I have bright area over here, instead of your eye being locked into the center of the frame, you're going to start to drift over this side. So the adjustment over here is aimed at darkening that, which means that the center of the frame has a little bit more real estate and kind of appeal to the viewer's eye. Then just darkening some of the shadows around here and enhancing what is already a naturally darker area along this side on the side of the face over here. What I do want to show you guys, and this is a big lesson that you can learn from here, is if I go in and say, right, I'm going to use a new brush, I don't use the auto mask feature at all. I prefer to use a combination of feather, flow and density, mainly the flow and density. I use a heavy feather because I don't want a hard edge. So if we have a look over here and we pull the feather all the way down, you'll see on the little cursor over here that it's a hard edge. And if I go in and add a feather, you'll see that the second outer ring, it means that that effect is going to be blended from that hard edge all the way out radiating outwards from the center. The other thing is I've pulled my density down to 70. Now essentially, if you can picture it as a spray can, and you can adjust the nozzle in that spray can, so when you push as hard as possible, you're adjusting the impact that that spray can is going to have. So if it's at full throttle, at 100%, you touch the nozzle once and 100% of its potential goes out. Now if you dial that back down, no matter how hard you press on top of that can, if you dial it to 70 like I have here, it's only going to apply 70% of its potential. Okay, so that's the one thing. The next thing is the flow, and that's essentially a slightly even more controlled adjustment, where as we go along, we're going to slowly but surely build up the effect. So if I go to a flow of 100 and I go and do a brush stroke now, I want to show you setting O so I can show you the selected overlay mask, and I brush down. You see that it's quite a pronounced brush stroke. Now using the numerical keys, I can adjust that flow. So if I take that flow down to 50 and I do the same adjustment, you see that with a single brush stroke, the effect is less pronounced. And the same thing if I take it to 30 and I do the same again, you'll see that it's very soft. However, if I start to go over the same area again and again, I start to build up the effect. And so what that allows me to do is, if I now take away this adjustment and I want to now make an adjustment on the edge of this frame here, you'll see that I can, on the edges, on the extreme edges, I'm not too phased if I go outside of the line, pun intended, not intended. Anyway, so I'm not too phased about that. However, once I start to get into the center over here, I can then start to either build up and go over the same area again and again, or I can start to brush with more confidence and take this up to a value of 80, and so that every brush stroke immediately has more value. So typically what I would do is I would go around my subject. Let's say that for argument's sake this was the adjustment that we wanted to make. I would go around the edges like that and then start to come back on the inside, so that the edge has the softest effect, whilst I'm building up the impact of the effect as we go on the inside. So hopefully that makes a little bit of sense. And what this means is that you're actually not leaving hard edges. Number one, hard edges on the outside of your main here. So if you do go a little bit over, it's not a big deal at all. And you're starting to build up the effect. So my personal preference would be to rather go over with a value of a flow of 40 over the same area again and again, and build it up, rather than go in with an area with a flow of 40 and then come on the inside with 80, because you're going to have an adjustment there. The idea with any localized adjustment is to try and keep it as natural as possible. No hard edges, and don't make it obvious. So hopefully that helps. I'm going to take away that adjustment now and show you the next pin that we've worked on. So this area over here, let's go up and just have a look at the effect that we've applied. So on this particular pin, just lifted the clarity. So this is within the focal plane that we'd originally set by choosing our aperture value of 4.5. I'm just punching this side of the face a little bit. Because this is brighter and we've got some details over here, we've been able to just add the clarity back and make this a little bit more prominent in the frame. Around the muzzle area and extending up, you can see that this area we've lifted the exposure by 0.4 and the clarity as well. And this is obviously, if we go and we switch off the brushes before and after, if you have a look at that area that we're talking about now, you can see it's quite dark compared to, as we lift it, it's a little bit brighter. And so overall, what we're doing there is, again, just bringing the viewer into this area of the face rather than pushing them outwards. So we've lifted that area along the bridge of the nose, as you can see over there. We've also lifted the eye a little bit. Eye is important in this one. The second last adjustment that we've done is just on this eye. Now obviously, if we go back and we have a look here before and after, so this is with the adjustments, that's after, so slightly darker. We're just lifting it a little bit. From an exposure point of view, 1 1/3, let's just have a look as we go back. So if we zero that effect, and I think 1 1/3 is probably too much. Please don't go and do things like this. Light can't fall in that sort of fashion. Even looking at it and saying, well, maybe 1 1/3 is a touch too much. Let's bring it back to 1 stop. Now, that translates to a massive adjustment. If you think about light in terms of one side to the other and having a 1 stop difference. But if we have a look at it before and after here, switching off the adjustments and there, looking at the final image, it doesn't look unnatural, at least to my eye. If you guys disagree, please, by all means, let me know. And then the final adjustment here with this little brush outside, and you can see here again how the combination of flow and density have worked to make sure that we're not leaving a halo or a hard edge around our subject. So going in, and this would have been done with a kind of flow of 20 and just brushing gently around these areas, around the edges, and then concentrating the brush strokes a little bit more on the outside, eventually to build up to something like this. And the adjustment that we've done there is that we've dropped the clarity. So clarity has gone down to -41. So if you have a look at it beforehand, there's a bit more detail in there. Pulling the clarity down just softens that background a little bit more. Again, we're not creating that bokeh or shallow depth of field. It was already there to begin with. What we are doing though is we're enhancing it. And we've also lifted the blacks. Now if we take the blacks back down, you see if we darken the blacks, it adds a little bit more detail into that background. By lifting the blacks, we've lightened it, and that's what we want. We wanted the light background with this contrast of the main being the main focus, pun intended on that one. Right, so overall, without the special adjustment of brushes, with the brushes applied, without the black and white mix applied, with the black and white mix applied. So the goal here was to create a dramatic image of a rather dramatic personality and character within the Mara, and one that we're hoping to catch up with in a couple of months' time. Hopefully he'll still be around. But overall, before and after. So again, you'll see that it's less about how the brushes can help you to achieve and polish something that you may not have already envisioned, but more about finishing off your creative vision. This was always the shot that we were kind of aiming for on this day, was to get a nice portrait of him. He never ever turned straight onto us, which would have helped from all sorts of different ways, but this was a shot that I was pretty happy with, and so was my guest. So yeah, that's it for this episode of Behind the Frame. Next week, Marlon is going to be having a look at sepia tones and applying split toning to images. You're not going to want to miss that one. So get some images and questions ready for Marlon coming up in the new week. As always, if you have any questions for me or any of the other team on images that you've seen us share on our various social media platforms, give us a shout. Cheers.